side would make the Republicans happiest at this point in time?
At this point, you can't sort them out. I mean, nobody is, and they're all so small, you really can't worry about them yet. I mean, one of them eventually, you assume, will become the nominee, but they're not even big enough to measure yet on any national scale to determine who has what kind of capacity. On the basis of message, clearly, Gephardt at this moment has struck a chord. I, for one, question that it will work nationally for the next 7 or 8 months. I question his capacity to carry it. Jeff makes the point about the personal credibility dimension that he ultimately has to pass. I don't think he does. I think all the Democrat candidates share the same problem. The biggest one I think Pat Robertson has, they also share, and that is they're too new on the national scene. And I think that's the big advantage Bob Dole, George Bush has. They're known. The last time the American people elected somebody unknown, they got Jimmy Carter. I think a lot of people still remember that. They almost caught Gary Hart in 1984, and they see what's happened there, and that's scary to them. I think Pat Robertson, Pete DuPont, all the Democrats share the same problem. They're just not known.
Eddie Mai, president of Eddie Mai Jr. and Associates, and Jeff Guerin, Democratic pollster, president of Guerin Hart Strategic Research Group. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Tonight, beginning at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, C-SPAN continues a look at the New Hampshire primary. Live coverage from around the state of New Hampshire will give you a behind-the-scenes look at the preparations being made for the nation's first primary. A preview of the New Hampshire primary, beginning at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Pacific Time on C-SPAN. Coming up next on C-SPAN, a speech delivered earlier this week by Republican presidential candidate Senator Robert Dole. He addressed a joint meeting of the New Hampshire State Legislature at the state capitol in Concord.
The chair would like to say it certainly is a great feeling to have the joint session for the purpose that we do today. Senator Bob Dole wants to prove that one of us can become President of the United States. Born in the rural town of Russell, Kansas, Bob Dole attended local public schools, and as a boy he worked at the soda fountain of the local drug store. He entered the University of Kansas planning to be a doctor, but left during the Second World War to enlist in the Army. Rising through the ranks, Bob became an officer in the crack 10th Mountain Division in Italy. In 1945, he was severely wounded in combat and was twice decorated for heroism. Bob spent 39 months in hospitals, fighting to stay alive and to recover from his wounds. His dream of being a physician was destroyed, but his friends back in Russell helped him piece his life back together, and he continued his education at the University of Arizona. In 1952, he earned his law degree from Washburn Municipal University in Topeka. Bob launched his political career at the age of 26 by winning a seat in the Kansas House of Representatives. He was elected to Congress in 1960, the start of a 28-year career on Capitol Hill. In Washington, Bob Dole earned a reputation as a common-sense fiscal conservative of demonstrated independence, toughness, and leadership. After 4 consecutive terms in the House and 20 years in the U.S. Senate, he has earned a reputation as an effective leader capable of building bridges between the diverse elements of the Senate and the executive branch. As chairman of the Senate Finance Committee from 1981 to 1984, Senator Dole helped President Reagan lay the foundation for the country's strongest economic recovery in 30 years. He was elected Senate Republican leader in 1984. He has led the fight for such key Reagan initiatives as a balanced budget amendment, tax indexing, the strategic defense initiatives, worldwide aid to freedom fighters, and the drive to reduce government spending. Believing that he can be a hands-on president who can work with Congress and make the hard choices on federal budget cuts to end the national deficit, Senator Dole is a leader who remembers where he comes from and has visions for where the country is going. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome to New Hampshire and introduce to you today one of us, Senator Robert Dole.
I assume you can say amen and we'll be all done.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I accept the nomination. Before I say anything, I wanted to make certain that people understood that one of my greatest resources and greatest assets, as all of you have, is my spouse, my wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you want to stand over? I also want to observe the great courtesy in which House members give to senators here and let you come in last and all those things. We're not accorded those all the time in Washington, but in any event, it's good to be here. It's good to be awake. It's good to feel good. New Hampshire is a great state, and I want to thank Doug Scanlon for arranging this timely visit. He told me not to worry about Iowa. He says, worry about New Hampshire. So I'm here. And I want to thank Doug and many others, in fact all of you, for your courtesies, and both me and Elizabeth, regardless of your party and regardless of the candidate you may be supporting. I also want to recognize a special friend of yours and a special friend of mine who brings all of us to New Hampshire every 4 years. Dick Upton is over here somewhere. Dick, good to see you. I am deeply grateful that I can make my first appearance in New Hampshire since yesterday's good day in Iowa. It's perhaps appropriate that we are here before this very unique citizen legislature, and I do have a special kind of feeling for this kind of an institution because, as Doug indicated, that's where I started my political career, in the state legislature. Must say, when I came back from World War II, I didn't know anything about politics. I remember being visited by a very fine lawyer in my hometown, Clifford Holland, who was a prominent Democrat, and he said, now Bob, you ought to, when you get to feeling better, you ought to take a look at politics. And I said, I don't know anything about politics. Well, and he said, also, of course, you ought to be a Democrat. And I said, and my parents were, I said, Cliff, Mr. Holland, I don't know anything about politics. He said, it's not necessary. You got shot, and I think we can get you elected. That's sort of how I was. Then I remember a Republican friend of mine who still practices law in Russell, Kansas, John Wolk. He came by and he said, I know Cliff Holland was by and wanted you to become a Democrat and get into politics. I said, I agree you ought to get into politics, but you ought to be a Republican. And I said, why? He said, because there are twice as many Republicans in this county as Democrats. So I made a great philosophical judgment right there on the spot. And I'm proud I did. But I might also add, just as an aside, that there have been some rather outstanding presidents who got their start in the state legislature. Abraham Lincoln started in the Illinois General Assembly at the age of 26. Teddy Roosevelt was 24 years of age when he won a seat in the New York Assembly. And as Doug has indicated, I was 26 when I was elected. And in 1952, my boyhood hero, Dwight Eisenhower, won the New Hampshire primary that catapulted him to the head of the Republican ticket. And today, the day after Iowa, it's a brand new contest in New Hampshire. And a week from now, the voters of New Hampshire will play a monumental part in the American drama of choosing our next president. Exactly 3 months ago today, November 9, 1987, when this campaign formally began in my hometown of Russell, Kansas, I said I wanted to lead America into an even greater era of opportunity for all our people and greater security for our nation. I offered a willingness to work hard, to hang tough, to go the distance, and I offered the strength and the determination to bring common sense answers to the complex problems facing America this century. And today I'm renewing my commitment to these goals. I happen to believe that America's greatness still lies ahead. The ideal nation our founders envisioned more than 200 years ago is yet to be achieved. Oh yes, we've made great progress, more than any other nation in the history of mankind. But I believe, and you believe, and most Americans believe, that we can do better yet. First, however, we must commit ourselves anew to dealing with the single greatest threat, in my view, to a prosperous and secure America: the federal budget deficit. $2.5 trillion, $200 billion a year in interest on the debt. And most of us who are campaigning for the presidency have been talking a good game and pointing with alarm to the deficit. But only one of us has been willing to lay out any real solution, including an across-the-board freeze on federal spending. If you think about it just for a moment, a one-year freeze and a number of variations, and a couple of my colleagues started all this 5 years ago, Senator Kassebaum and Senator Grassley. And they were joined by two Democrats, Senator Baucus and Senator Biden. And there are all kinds of variations of a freeze, but a one-year freeze is $50 billion in savings, no new taxes, no gimmicks, real savings. And over a 3-year period, it's $150 billion. And after you initiate the freeze, very early in 1989, then you sat down with the Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, and then the President of the United States goes over program by program, and we go to work on the next budget. It's across the board, no exceptions except for vulnerable groups in America: the hungry, the homeless, the poor. It has bipartisan support in the Congress. It has bipartisan support across the country. And I believe that one advantage I have over many of my colleagues, and they're all good candidates in both parties, is that I know how to work with the legislative body, just as you do. I've been doing it for over 27 years. I can sit down with Republicans and Democrats alike, and we can hammer out solutions to some of the problems. Not all the time. Sometimes it's a matter of principle. Sometimes you shouldn't work it out. And we can do all this without raising tax rates on individuals or corporations. And as one who forged a consensus on the plan to save Social Security from bankruptcy in 1983, I believe, I hope I can say it modestly, that I am the one candidate who has demonstrated his commitment to keeping those brown envelopes coming, and incidentally with a check inside. And I think that's very important. I happen to believe that getting rid of our deficits, and I have an expert with me, Pete Domenici, was chairman of the Budget Committee, still does outstanding work as a ranking Republican. And he will tell you, and I will tell you, and we'll tell each other, that getting rid of the deficit is just as important for America's international position as it is for our own well-being at home. The rest of the world knows. The Soviets know. The Japanese know. Our adversaries know. And all our allies know that we cannot hold our own in today's world unless we demonstrate the political will to deal with the federal deficit. This past decade, the 1980s, has been a decade of growth and prosperity and peace for America. I might say all of that thanks to the leadership of one man, President Ronald Reagan. But the next president must be prepared to deal with a vastly different world than we have, and one that we've faced over the past quarter of a century. Not since the years immediately following World War II have we faced a challenge so great and so potent. How we respond to that challenge will determine whether our security, our prosperity, and our stature in the world will flourish into the next century, or whether we will retreat and decline. I'm reminded of this TV commercial that maybe some of you have seen. It shows a young man about 18 years of age, maybe 19. It shows a big steel door, and this young man is pounding on the door and pounding on the door, and there's a little glass and you can look inside. And inside that door are cobwebs and the bones of Congresses past and administrations past. And the young man is pounding and pounding and pounding, and he's saying and he's screaming, "What have you done to my future? What have you done to my future?" And he's talking about the federal deficit. There's not a one of us in this chamber, regardless of our politics, Republican or Democrat, man or woman, who wouldn't do almost anything for our children or our grandchildren. And they're the ones I'm concerned about. My generation can escape. Maybe your generation can escape. But let's not torpedo the opportunities that rightfully belong to our children and our grandchildren by backing away from dealing with the federal deficit. It's not going to go away. It's not going to grow away. We have to deal with it. So it just seems to me that what we need in this time is continued strong, decisive leadership, imagination, and a certain amount of courage. Courage to go to the voters. Courage to rally the Congress. And to get things done in America. And I think to get all that done, in addition to the deficit, we're going to have to start focusing on some other basics. Basics like freedom and communism. And I have grappled with issues of U.S.-Soviet relations throughout 3 decades of public life. I have visited the Soviet Union. I have met Mikhail Gorbachev. And based on all that, I can tell you 2 things, which probably don't come as any surprise to anyone in this room, in this chamber. Whatever glasnost is, it is not democracy. Whatever else Gorbachev may be, he is still a hard-as-nails communist. And when Gorbachev left Washington a few weeks back, with many still in the grip of glasnost fever, he flew back to a godless communist state with very little freedom and a miserable standard of living. And that's where he woke up the next day. But we, all of us, we awoke in freedom in the freest and most just country in the world. And I just suggest wherever I go that we must not forget that basic difference. So when we deal with the Soviets, it must be from strength. And when we talk and have a dialogue with Mr. Gorbachev, it should never be in blind faith. We make no agreements with the Soviet Union unless they're in our national interest. We don't trust Mr. Gorbachev. That's not even relevant. And I'd like to mention very quickly just 4 issues, because no, when 20 minutes is over, I'll be the only one standing here. At least I've been told that's how it works. Issue number 1 is Central America. And I believe the House vote to cut off aid to the Contras was a grievous strategic mistake. The issue in Central America is not that Daniel Ortega's army threatens the Texas border. It is the Soviet bases and intelligence facilities and advisors and soon perhaps Soviet aircraft and submarines that may threaten the fragile small democracies of the Americas. The Panama Canal, remember that? And America's own security. It is not America which causes war in Central America, but Soviet intervention in our hemisphere. At our Republican National Convention in 1984, one of our most dedicated and able national leaders, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, said it as clearly and as eloquently as it can be said. She said, "There are some people in America who always," and I quote, "always blame America first," end of quote. Now, we cannot abandon the field of those people. We cannot let this House vote stand as a final act of this drama. And regardless of what a bare majority of liberal House Democrats want, we cannot stand by and watch Americans' own national security be compromised by naive faith in Marxist dictators like Daniel Ortega. America is always ready to give peace a chance. Ronald Reagan is always ready to give peace a chance. When will Ortega give peace a chance? When will Castro give peace a chance? And finally, when will General Secretary Gorbachev give peace a chance? And I must say I'm proud of this letter, which I brought a copy of along today, a letter from Ronald Reagan, received yesterday, saluting my leadership in winning the Senate vote on Contra aid. Some say it didn't mean a thing. I think it meant a great deal as far as the future of our policy is concerned. The House of Representatives may be willing to throw in the towel on freedom, but Bob Dole isn't, and America isn't, and I've already sent my contribution for freedom. And today I urge all private Americans to join me in this legal, above-board effort to provide humanitarian support to the freedom fighters of Nicaragua. Then there is the critical issue of arms control. Ladies and gentlemen, the headlong rush toward achieving a strategic arms reduction treaty may put us on strategic thin ice. So let me say very flatly and very clearly, I would sign no further arms control agreements with the Soviet Union until we are absolutely 110% sure of 2 things. First, that they can be verified, and second, that they will not undermine the deterrence power of the United States beyond any shadow of a doubt. And let me add, too, the next arms reduction agreement should be a conventional arms reduction agreement, because until we get Soviet conventional forces down to manageable size, any strategic arms reduction treaty can compromise the very deterrents that protect us from Soviet attack and also preserves the peace. We must link any so-called START agreement to resolving the overwhelming Soviet advantage in conventional forces in Europe. We must also insist that our allies carry their fair share of the load in global peacekeeping. Our European and Asian allies deserve first consideration in our foreign policy consultations. But they must also recognize that an alliance is a two-way street. When America comes to the defense of a mutual friend, we have the right to insist we not be there alone. And finally, there is perhaps the most important single contribution of President Reagan's term to preserve American freedom, and that is the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Scuttling our only nuclear defense insurance policy remains one of the very highest priorities for Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev's best chance to kill SDI is to get Americans to buy the phony proposition that giving SDI to get a START agreement would be a good trade for America. SDI should not be on the table in the START talks, period. We should not be negotiating with the Soviets on our own military R&D options. We should not be tying our own hands unilaterally through self-imposed legislative restraints on the President's right to pursue SDI wherever it may lead us. And for those Republicans who are campaigning to pick up the national security legacy that Ronald Reagan will leave behind, I challenge them to join me in this clear and unequivocal pledge. I will develop SDI, I will test SDI, and I will deploy SDI. And I would like to close by recalling an experience that Elizabeth and I had when we visited the Soviet Union a few years ago. An experience neither one of us will ever forget. And maybe it's been repeated by some in this audience. We went to the basement of our embassy in Moscow and talked with two families from Siberia who had sought asylum from religious persecution. In attempting to reach our embassy's gates, one of the young sons was caught by Russian guards, beaten in full sight of the two families, and then dragged away. Not until 3 weeks later did they learn that he had been thrown on a train back to Siberia. It was nearly 5 years, separated from their friends and family, and living in the basement of that embassy before the Soviet government allowed those families to emigrate to Israel. And as we drove to the airport to begin our long trip home, I looked up at that airplane sitting on the runway with the United States of America emblazoned on its side. It was a stirring sight that filled me with love for our country. And I just thank God I could go home to America, home to freedom, home to democracy. And I resolved as I stood there on that Soviet airfield, that I would do everything in my power not only to secure our freedom, but to spread its light around the world. And I would just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for giving me this privilege. I'm honored to be in your presence. It's great to be an American, regardless of any differences we may have politically. But we have some very tough challenges ahead. But we're tough people. All of us are tough people. We've been through wars, through depression, through national crises and national tragedies. We're still America, and that still means something. And I've said many times as I've traveled around America, you know, we're not perfect. People complain about America. People complain about politicians in Congress, maybe even state legislatures. Probably not as much. But that's part of the American system. That's part of freedom. We wouldn't have it any other way. But in all the 27 plus years I've been in the Congress of the United States, I'm still waiting to receive the first letter from any of my constituents in Kansas saying, Bob, get me out of this awful country. But I've had a lot of letters and a lot of phone calls and a few personal, tearful meetings with people saying, can you get my mother into America? Can you get my children into America? And I think that pretty much says it all. And being here in New Hampshire, where your state motto is live free or die, being here in this state legislature, I see and I sense and I think I know what America means. It means individuals like all of us, proud individuals. It means groups and communities working together. It means parties and politicians competing freely as only we can in America. And finally, it means freedom. We wouldn't trade our system for any other system in the world. You wouldn't trade your legislature for any other legislature in America. I wouldn't trade my years in Congress and my years in the state legislature for many experiences. Got one in mind. But I've had a great deal of fun, great many opportunities, a great many challenges. And all this means one thing. It all means that in America we're free. It all means in America we can do just about anything we're able to do. We can fulfill our potential. But above all, it means freedom. Freedom ringing loudly and clearly and consistently and on forever. And that's what America's all about. I'd like to think that's what Bob Dole's all about. Small town traditional values,